In favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 12:43. We will finish at 1:43. I will recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on one hand, we have government telling us there will be fewer Nova Scotians who will be employed in the coming year, and that nominal GDP will rise by 2.3% next year and 3% the following year. Yet, on the other hand, Mr. Speaker, the Premier is telling Nova Scotians that personal income tax revenue will have a surge of 7% next year. So, Mr. Speaker, with fewer people working, how is the government going to get an additional $145 million in personal income tax revenue?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, two problems with the question. One is this, unemployment can go up and the number of people who are working can also go up. It's because the labour force expands, and that, in fact, is what is happening in Nova Scotia. The second problem with his question is it doesn't account for the fact that incomes are also increasing, both of which drive things like personal income tax and HST.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, two problems with that answer. Mr. Speaker, there are more part-time workers than full-time workers. Mr. Speaker, and I don't know what Nova Scotians he's been talking to, but the salaries in this province aren't increasing 7% across the board. Mr. Speaker, we know that last year, Mr. Speaker, labour income growth, Mr. Speaker, was at a slower pace than was observed during the recession in 2009. So think about that, Mr. Speaker. Labour income growth was at a slower pace than was observed during the recession of 2009. When you think about that, remember his answer on the last question, Mr. Speaker. Population has slowed, retail sales were the weakest since the recession, and inflation has been faster than the national average. Mr. Speaker, none of the data points to a spike in personal income tax. So how does the Premier expect that there's going to be such a high level of tax revenue in the coming year?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the assumptions that are put into the data was tested and confirmed by rating agencies across the country, by the Conference Board of Canada, by the Auditor General's office, by most of the economic academics across the country. And in fact, even yesterday, the Auditor General was on the radio saying that these assumptions are a perfectly reasonable set of assumptions in line with what has always been done in the past. The first time in a decade that he has issued an unqualified opinion with respect to the assumptions put into the budget, Mr. Speaker. This is a government that observes the very highest standards of transparency, the very highest standards of accounting principles with respect to our budget, and I am very proud of the work done by the Minister of Finance. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I think what the Auditor General said is that he had no opinion when it came to the revenue assumptions that the government was going to try to achieve, Mr. Speaker. But what he did say, what he has been saying now for months, is that this government had a $27 million mistake in the previous budget, Mr. Speaker, which they knew about when they stood in this House and tabled the budget, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, he's also raised the issue that that's why Nova Scotians have some concerns about anything coming out of this government, Mr. Speaker, because, quite frankly, it's hard to believe, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has said that, Mr. Speaker, that we'll have a slower economy. Not sure, Mr. Speaker, if you want to, I don't know if they want to talk or you want me to finish my question. Mr. Speaker, the government has said that we will have a slower economy, higher unemployment, and greater exposure to international risk. So, Mr. Speaker, how can the Premier tell Nova Scotians that we'll have a 7% surge in income tax revenue next year?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, quite the opposite. In fact, every rating agency says that in terms of economic growth, after 20 years of the worst economic growth in the country, we are now going to move into the middle of the pack. You are going to see many new projects starting this year, whether it's the investment in the offshore. People only have to look around Halifax to see that there are more than 30 building cranes over Halifax right now. Major projects underway, Mr. Speaker. And on top of all that, if we didn't need anything else, on top of of all that, Statistics Canada reported just last month a growth of 5,600 full-time jobs in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, the answer to the Leader of the Liberal Party's question is that the budget contained a hidden tax increase as a result of bracket creep that's going to yield them tens of millions of dollars. That is part of what Nova Scotians are discovering about the NDP, that it's very expensive to live in NDP Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, when in opposition, the member for Halifax Fairview said of bracket creep, and I quote, "That is as much of a tax grab as the Minister of Finance reaching into your pocket or into your wallet or into your purse and taking out the money." And I will table that quote for the benefit of the Premier. Mr. Speaker, $300 more per person out of the pockets of each and every Nova Scotian this year as a result of the budget last week. My question to the Premier, how is reaching into the pockets of Nova Scotians through more hidden taxes for another $300 a year a balanced plan?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, the Leader of the Conservative Party should reflect on the fact that the budget of Nova Scotia used to be linked, with respect to income tax, used to be linked to the federal government. And I believe when he was Chief of Staff for the former government, they decoupled from the federal income tax rules, specifically so that they would not have to pay any increase with respect to inflation and with respect to the so-called bracket creep. So, Mr. Speaker, I would say that, to quote a much more famous person than I, that if he has a problem with this, he should start by looking at the man in the mirror.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if the Premier is going to give us a history lesson, he should at least check the history books before he does, because the government of that time decoupled from the federal government because the federal Liberal government of the day was raising taxes, and we didn't want to have any of that here in Nova Scotia. That's what happened, Mr. Speaker. How convenient to forget that. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
The federal Liberals are doing something they decided to screw every Nova Scotia.
I'd remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition that that word is unparliamentary, and I'd ask him to retract it, please.
Certainly will. I certainly will, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly will. They decided to fleece every Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on a continuation of his second supplement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I hit a nerve on many sides of the House with that statement of the historical fact. Mr. Speaker, when he was in opposition, the member for Halifax Fairview said, and I quote, "The most insidious tax of all, bracket creep, is where they get higher tax revenues by stealth." You know, Mr. Speaker, I miss him more every day, the member for Halifax Fairview, but I will table that for the benefit of the Premier. My question to the Premier is, why not be upfront with Nova Scotians that getting higher taxes by stealth is not a transparent and balanced plan?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
But you wouldn't run against them.
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, there is no question that budgets are about choices, and we watched for years while the Conservative governments made choices. They increased their budgetary spending by hundreds of millions of dollars and then overspent it by hundreds of millions of dollars. And this created a situation in this province where there was no elasticity in our budgets whatsoever. And in fact, when the financial crisis hit in 2009 and essentially washed away the budgets of provinces and states and jurisdictions not only across North America, across the world, it meant that now budgets had to be rebuilt, which is what we did in this province. And in the first opportunity that we have to balance the books and to make sure that it's balanced not only financially but socially, we decided to refund the taxes for lowest income seniors. I think that was the right choice.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if the Premier were serious about balancing the budget in all the ways that means, he wouldn't have repealed the balanced budget law that was on the books of Nova Scotia when he came in, so he could table all those deficit budgets and raise the taxes on each and every single Nova Scotian, taking with one hand and giving a little bit back with the other. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia's economy is struggling. Jobs are being lost because we have the highest taxes in all of Canada. And in the meantime, the Premier's response is to spend ever more money bailing out large companies and others with Nova Scotia's hard-earned tax dollars. You know, Mr. Speaker, it reminds me of something that Margaret Thatcher once said when she said, and by the way, when she said the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Now, Mr. Speaker, how often can you quote the member for Halifax Fairview and Margaret Thatcher in the same question?
Not often. Not often.
That's tough to do. In any event, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have run out of money paying for the NDP, so my question to the Premier is, will he admit, finally, the truth that the only answer he has to his own budget problems is to dig ever deeper into the pockets of Nova Scotians?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, almost half of the people in this province pay lower taxes now than they did when we came into office in 2009, whether it's through HST, because it is through rebates like the affordability tax credit, like the disability tax credit, like the refund of senior citizens' income tax, which has been increased again this year. All of these mean that these citizens have more money in their pockets than they did before 2009. Because, as I said, budgets are about choices. We choose to invest in the welfare of the people of this province. We choose to understand that investment in businesses and communities means that the people of those communities have paychecks to take home to support their families, that their families have food on the table, and that they are able to support the local economy because they have a job. We realize that he is running on a platform that says stop more jobs. We disagree.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. We know that we are facing employment declines in the coming year, and we are facing a slowing economy. We know that there has been a shift from full-time to part-time employment for workers in Nova Scotia. We know that in the years following the recession, our economy has grown at a slower rate than the rest of the country, Mr. Speaker. The budget states quite clearly that growth in nominal GDP is expected to be 2.3% in 2013 and 3% in 2014. Population is lagging behind the rest of the country as well, Mr. Speaker. And of course, labour income growth last year was slower than what it was observed during the recession. All of these things affect the tax base, Mr. Speaker, but yet with all these weak indicators, the Premier and the government expect a surge in personal income tax revenue in the coming year. My question, will the Minister of Economic Development tell Nova Scotians how provincial income tax revenue can be expected to grow at a rate of 7% in the medium term when nominal GDP growth rates are forecast to be 2.3% and 3% respectively in the next 2 years?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I do know for sure is that the latest statistics coming out of the labour workforce shows that Nova Scotia, the only jurisdiction in Canada that had a gain, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's because we are doing things different. You know, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is correct. Tough times have been here. But, you know, we are about to turn the corner. You know, we got the ships contract, Mr. Speaker. For the next 30 years, we are going to peak 11,500 jobs, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's tax revenue, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The federal government is expecting slower nominal GDP growth to cut into their own revenue. The feds have downgraded their revenue projections to 3.8% growth. This is down from 6% last year and down from 5% growth projection they had in their last file update. In short, Mr. Speaker, the federal government is expecting their tax base to contract. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain how Nova Scotia is the exception?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, the short answer to that question is because here in Nova Scotia what we have is an NDP government left by the best premier in the country of Canada.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, as we've seen in those recent StatsCan numbers, the unemployment rate in Cape Breton, folks, Mr. Speaker, the unemployment rate in Cape Breton is now 18.6%. So I wonder if the minister will come and smile and talk about the NDP government at the Chamber of Commerce with an 18% unemployment rate. This premier and this government have a history of promising much more than they can deliver, Mr. Speaker, shifting payments from one fiscal year when it's convenient and failing to disclose revenue overstatements when it doesn't suit their narrative. Now we have a budget that tells us there's going to be higher unemployment and slower economic growth. But still, the government is telling Nova Scotians that revenues will be up, Mr. Speaker. After this government's track record, how can Nova Scotians trust the minister and his government's revenue projections now?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in my place in response to that. And do you know what? Nova Scotians believe in this government, and I heard the member mention the Chamber of Commerce, but I want to table something here by the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. And you know, this is a bulletin by the Halifax Chamber, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia Jobs Here strategy has assisted small business through many initiatives, and we are pleased that the government will continue to fund this strategy for Chamber members. Mr. Speaker, the Chamber goes on to say, and I quote, we commend the government for following through on its commitment to further reduce the small business tax from 3.5% to 3%. 4 years in a row, Mr. Speaker, we have reduced the small business tax. A government that does things differently.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As of March the 26th, 1,009,676 seniors were enrolled in the Seniors Pharmacare program. This program was originally designed as a 75-25 program, with 25% being in the form, premiums and co-pays from seniors. 2010, this government, not any other government, this NDP government changed regulations to increase the seniors percentage to 28%. So that they could avoid reducing the premium and co-pays for seniors. These same regulations remain in effect today. My question to the Minister of Health, could the Minister please indicate what percentage of drug costs seniors are paying now?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the work we've done to support our seniors across the province. We've worked on a number of initiatives to ensure that there's more money in the pockets of seniors in Nova Scotia today than there ever has been in the past, Mr. Speaker. We're working extremely hard as a department to ensure that drug costs, not only for seniors but all Nova Scotians, are lower today, Mr. Speaker, than in years previous, and I'm proud of that work that we've done.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier is exactly right. Budgets are about choices, and what they've done to seniors, the pharmacare program is take out of one pocket and give a little bit back in the other. Mr. Speaker, based on a Freedom of Information request, I can tell you that 2010-11 seniors paid 28.4%. In 2011-12, 29.2%. And as of mid-March of this year, seniors were paying in the pharmacare program 32%. Each and every year, seniors were paying more than their share of the costs, and this NDP government has been paying less. And I'll table that document, Mr. Speaker. Could the Premier please tell us why seniors have not seen a reduction in their premium or co-pay despite the fact they should have?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is a government that, again this year, will put money into the budget to ensure that that seniors do not see an increase in pharmacare costs. But over and above that, this is also a government that has been working to ensure that there is fair drug pricing so that all seniors who have to depend on medication to deal with any issue that they may have with their health has cheaper prices. That is a commitment that we made and one that we worked on not only within the province but of course that I have worked on as the chair of the Council of Federation for along with the premiers of Prince Edward Island and Saskatchewan to ensure that drug pricing, whether it's in our jurisdiction or across the country, is approached fairly and provides moderately priced drugs for seniors who obviously face the preponderance of the kind of health issues that physicians would see.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality is seniors are paying a lot more. Government is paying even less. Mr. Speaker, we have seen unrealistic economic assumptions with this budget. We have seen prepayments to universities despite how repugnant government found these prepayments to be when they were in opposition. And now we see government balancing the books by charging seniors more on premiums and co-pays. My question to the minister, why is it fair for seniors to be paying more in premiums and co-pays when they should when government continues to pay less?
Honourable the Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another example of the Liberal Party misleading Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We've worked hard to reduce our drug costs here in the province, Mr. Speaker. Governments across the country recognize we need to support our seniors. And what's even more shameful, Mr. Speaker, is when we bring legislation to this House, the Fair Drug Prices Act, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals voted against it, Mr. Speaker. They voted against ensuring seniors paid less for drugs in this province, Mr. Speaker. They should be ashamed of themselves.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Tim Hortons outlets that are at our hospitals here in Halifax continue to get a subsidy from this government of $1.5 million, something that the Minister of Health has previously called spending on health care. Well, Mr. Speaker, subsidizing Tim Hortons is not spending on health care, so I will ask the Premier, will the Premier cancel finally the Tim Hortons subsidy and direct that money back into actual frontline health care?
Honourable the Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I guess like many people, I saw the story that was on CTV, I believe, at the time. So I asked some questions about it, and it turned out that the information that was being conveyed to the public was in fact incorrect. In fact, some of those franchises make a profit, and I'm going to table for the information of the Leader of the Conservative Party the budget breakdown for this that actually shows that there was a small deficit, about $12,000, between all of the franchises. But I would also remind the Leader that that's because that franchise does not sell any of the usual products from Tim Hortons. In fact, it's a healthy food outlet for people waiting for either loved ones or for those who are in the hospital. No matter what kind of a kitchen you have or cafeteria you have, they run at a deficit. This one runs at a very small one.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
The business plans of his own Capital District Health Authority, because for 4 years in a row they have begged the government to stop subsidizing those outlets so that they could use that money for actual health care. Mr. Speaker, in Newfoundland, they had the exact same situation, $1.5 million subsidizing Tim Hortons in their hospitals, but they did the right thing. Mr. Speaker, the Health Board CEO in Newfoundland, Ms. Kaminsky, says, and I quote, "We cannot continue to subsidize those non-direct care services when we know that we can be providing more effectively and efficiently elsewhere." Mr. Speaker, I'll table that for the benefit of the Premier. So I will ask the Premier again, will he accept the common sense approach of Ms. Kaminsky and the Newfoundland Health Board and stop bailing out the hospital Tim Hortons so that that money can go where it actually belongs, real health care?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's an odd thing, of course, because the decision to put the Tim Hortons in there, of course, belonged to the hospital and to the District Health Authority. They're the ones who made the decision at the time. They continue to make these decisions. The only thing that we have said is that they're not going to they are not going to affect the livelihood of the employees who work there, who support their families through the jobs that they have there. They're not going to contract those out simply to run down the wages of a few poor people who happen to work there at decent jobs. We're not going to allow that to happen. We care about those people. This is a very small deficit in the Tim Hortons franchise there, and it's not even all of them. Some of them, in fact, make surpluses. So, I understand that this question was motivated by the stories that appeared. I think maybe he ought to just rethink his line of questioning.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in the Premier's first answer, he says, oh no, we're not really subsidizing them. And then in his second answer, he defends the very subsidy that he denied in the first answer. You know what, Mr. Speaker, you know what people want? They want spending on doctors and nurses. They want more money for those things, not a defense of the subsidy of the Tim Hortons in our hospitals. It shouldn't take a surgeon to know that if you cut that subsidy, you can put that money, $1.5 million, into actual health care. Mr. Speaker, you could do more insulin pumps. You could do more CF screening. You could do a lot more things with that money if you'd stop subsidizing the Tim Hortons. So I'll ask the Premier, will he explain to the people of Nova Scotia why he insists on continuing that subsidy when that money could go to actual health care?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I thought I explained to him that obviously there is not a subsidy there, and in fact there's a very small deficit being run, I think, in one of the locations. I also explained to him that this was a decision that was made by the District Health Authority because they were trying to cut costs associated with other operations that they took on. So, Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is ensuring, A, that the people who work there do not become the scapegoats in this story, and have them and their families penalized because they make $12 an hour giving services to patients in hospitals and their loved ones. We're not going to penalize them for doing their jobs.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tonight, the South Shore Regional School Board will make a decision about the fate of several schools in their board in light of the Minister of Education's recent request to halt school reviews. The same item is on the agenda for Chignecto Central Board when they meet tomorrow night. So my question to the Minister is this: what direction will the Minister give to the boards if they do not honour her request?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking forward to hearing back from the boards and the decision they're making with the request that I made. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess that means that the minister has no plan one more time. Mr. Speaker, parents, teachers, communities and school boards have dedicated hundreds of hours to this school review process. Classrooms are already feeling the impact of this government's 65 million cuts last 2 years, 11 plus million cut this year, and communities are wondering how the minister's request will affect the delivery of public education in their schools. So my question to the minister, will the minister give those school boards more money to keep schools open if they choose to honour her request?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I made a request of the school boards about a week ago to suspend the process because we've been hearing back from parents and community members of how adversarial and non-productive the discussions have been around the school review process. So I look forward to hearing from the boards and with the decision that they're making, and I'm also looking forward to working with Nova Scotians and community to find a better way forward with our school review process. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister in legislation in 2010 had an opportunity to make things right in that process and chose not to do that and allowed boards and communities to go through 3 more years of agony. Boards are being forced to weigh decreasing budgets against increasing needs. Funding has been slashed by this government while costs continue to rise. South Shore Board alone pays nearly $1 million in power bills, and boards are having to choose between operations and direct classroom supports for students. And now they're faced with political interference in the review process. So my question to the minister is this. If boards honour the minister's request, and if the minister refuses to provide additional resources, what advice does she give those boards to cover those increasing costs?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much. And we have provided our budget targets to our school boards early on in the process, and we have made sure that we've increased our spending in special education, and I'm looking forward to hearing back from the boards on their decisions around the school review. And again, I will restate, I'm looking forward to working with our community and our families to find a better way forward with the school review process, which will benefit each and every one of our children in our schools. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we learned last week that unemployment in Cape Breton has soared to 18.6%. That means that 1 in 6 who want to work cannot find a job. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister ERDT, will the Minister admit that their economic plan has been an absolute disaster for the people of Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you talk about disaster. I will give you an example of a disaster. 1993, Mr. Speaker. 1993, when the PCs were in power, when unemployment in Cape Breton reached an all-time high of 29.1%, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we can't live in the past with that. We're now in 2013. There are nearly 44,000 unemployed people in Cape Breton. Along with the loss of jobs, people are losing hope. Cape Breton's population has decreased by almost 4% in the last 4 years due to the hardships the NDP have inflicted. So my question to the minister is, will the minister admit that life is so tough in NDP Cape Breton that hard-working people are being forced to leave our beautiful island?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned yesterday, we are working in the opposite direction of our federal counterparts, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, where are Veteran Affairs going in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker? Where's Revenue Canada going in, Mr. Speaker? Where are all these contact centres that are run by the government going in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker? The PC counterparts in Ottawa are killing jobs, Mr. Speaker, while we are creating good jobs in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the number of unemployed people has increased by almost 7% in the last 4 years. The NDP have created a perfect storm of high taxes, the highest power rates, and no real plan for creating jobs. Will the minister admit that in order to get our economy running again, we need to cut taxes, stop wasteful government spending, in order to create good-paying jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is saying that our investment in East Coast fabrication, metal fabrication, was a waste of money. Mr. Speaker, what the member opposite is saying that our investment in Bill Did It in Cape Breton, a waste of money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the member opposite is saying that our investment in Port Hawkesbury New Page in saving 1,400 jobs was the waste of money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the member opposite is saying is that our investment in the future of Maritime Link to create jobs and sustainable energy in Cape Breton is a waste of money. Shame! Shame!
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask the Minister of Education, would she please tell members of this House what materials the department currently has in its possession to deliver the new math programs that are being introduced and implemented in September of this year?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much for the question. I had a lovely meeting this morning with Anne Blackwood in the department, and she assures me that all of the materials that are needed for the new math program that we're rolling out are delivered in the schools from last year's, from the current year's budget, and the forward years are for the grade 10. Everything has been tendered and everything is coming in on time. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there is a difference between tendered and delivered, so I may have to ask the Minister that. Last night, the Minister told this House that the department had some materials to deliver the curriculum. However, we have learned that the request for proposal for such materials was issued on March the 6th and March the 8th, and it suggests otherwise, and I will table the tender. The tender documents call for, quote, student and teacher resources, print and electronic, to support the grade 3 math curriculum, and quote, print and teacher resource, print and electronic materials to support the grade 10 math course. So according to these requests, Mr. Speaker, the initial delivery date for these materials are May 31st and June the 7th of this year. In fact, those tenders have not even closed. So, will the Minister please clarify, does the department have the materials that teachers and students will need, or is there still an open tender to get them?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development, Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will just repeat what I said, that the materials for the younger grades are in place already, and their tenders are out for other materials. This is a big initiative, and there have been many materials already put in place. Materials are tendered, and they will be in the hands of the teachers. I would also say that the teachers have been in service during this year for the implementation of the program. Starting in September, there will be ongoing in-servicing for the teachers as this rolls out over a 3-year time frame. But materials, some are in place, some are being tendered. This is a big project, and teachers will have their materials. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, every time the Minister stands up, we get two different messages. So will the Minister please be clear? On the one hand, the Minister told us last night the department had materials to support the programs that would be introduced, and she told us that in-servicing had already begun. Later, she said the in-servicing would be held in the summer. She also said the department had the materials to support the program. Now we know the tenders are still open for those materials. So my question to the Minister is this: how can parents, students and teachers have any confidence that this Minister has a plan when her responses continue to be conflicting and contradictory?
Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm really proud of the work that the department has done around the implementation of the new program that we are going to be introducing for the students in this province to make sure that they are getting the appropriate math that they need to be successful in this world. We know that materials are in the department for some of the grades. There's a tender out for other materials. It's a work in progress, and there's been ongoing in-servicing. There will continue to be ongoing in-servicing, and on top of all the in-servicing that's already been done, there will be summer institutes for teachers offered at the school boards on a regional basis. So I will repeat the same thing I've been saying. There are materials in place. Materials are continuing to come. In-servicing has been ongoing, and there will be continuing in-servicing to make sure that we provide the very best program that our students in this province can have, and we are going to make sure that our children are going to be successful. Unlike the remarks that our children were getting when we came into government, we want our children to succeed. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, we're just into a debate on the budget now, as we know, but I have a recommendation for the Minister already, so new into this budget year, to save money, and the hospital in Inverness needs a CT scan. It will save over $700,000 a year in transport costs of shipping patients down to Sydney. In a year and a half, it'll pay for itself, and from then on, it'll start saving the government upwards of $700,000 a year in transportation costs. Will the minister act to make the purchase of this CT scan?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. We've worked extremely hard over the last number of years with our district health authorities to ensure that we provide the services for our patients, no matter what community they live in, Mr. Speaker. And we're going to continue to do that. The district health authorities bring forward lists of each of the requests that they have around the province for capital projects or equipment that is needed, Mr. Speaker. We have a committee that looks through that and reviews it, and I look forward to ensuring all Nova Scotians know exactly how we're going to move forward to ensure that they can gain access to the services they need.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the minister will know, I certainly talked to the DHA, and of course I've asked them this as well, but we do know that it is actually the Department of Health that makes decisions to purchase equipment in the order of $90,000 or more. So really the buck does stop with the minister, and the recently commissioned report on surgery at Inverness Hospital recommended that the CT scan be purchased. Why not accept the recommendation and get on with saving money, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly what we're doing. When we came into government in 2009, Mr. Speaker, we had the Department of Health and Wellness and the province of Nova Scotia had one of the, if not the highest, costs for health administration in the country. We've worked hard to reduce that to today we're below the national average. And what we've done with that, Mr. Speaker, is redirect those funds, redirected them to frontline services so that we could expand services. Expand services like insulin pumps for children, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work in that manner.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, these are good things, and I hope the minister takes my recommendation today, and make people back in Inverness very happy. The physicians caring for people at the hospital need this CT scan. The average age of the population on the western side of Cape Breton Island is of an age that may suffer, it's in an age category that has the highest incidence for stroke. And the earlier stroke is identified and addressed when it happens, the better the outcome for the patient. And, Mr. Speaker, that's going to save the government money as well in reduced care costs. So the community has raised $2 million, and we need the CT scan to recruit future physicians. Why is the minister delaying the decision, which has obvious benefits for everyone involved?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a process in place that allows district health authorities to come forward with their requests to the department with the equipment that they need, with the services that they want, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of our commitment to work with the district health authorities to find those health administrative costs for one, Mr. Speaker, and we recognize the importance of having those decisions made on a local level. That's why we're committed, to, Mr. Speaker, unlike the Conservative government, who would rather have those decisions made in Halifax, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to take that route. We're going to ensure local decisions are made. They're going to bring their requests forward to the Department of Health. We have a process and a committee in place that will evaluate that. And as we are able to ensure and provide the funds for those pieces of equipment around the province, we're going to do that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia has the highest rate of sexual assault and some of the lowest charge, conviction and sentencing rates in Canada. In a letter to the Dalles Gazette in March of last year, the executive director of the Avalon Sexual Assault Centre reiterated her call on this government to, quote, implement a province-wide strategy to address sexualized violence. And I'll table that. The needs assessment on sexualized assault services in Nova Scotia found the province lacks comprehensive sexual assault services. We knew this a year ago. My question is to the Minister of Justice. Where is the sexual assault strategy and when can we expect it?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Any type of violence in our society is unacceptable, and the processes, and I have great confidence in the police, in the courts, in public prosecution, that when allegations are brought forward, that they're properly investigated, that there's compassion, there's understanding, and that each issue is addressed and dealt with in its own manner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the sexual assault nurse examiner program is only available in Halifax and Antigonish. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, assaults are happening across the province. What advice does the Minister of Justice have for women who experience sexual violence in Yarmouth? For women in Cape Breton, how can they access these services?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, as the Minister of Justice and responsible for policing in the province and for these types of allegations, in each of the hospitals there's proper procedures and protocols in place that deal with sexual assault. I have great confidence in the police that when an allegation is brought forward, that they conduct the appropriate investigations. And when those investigations are completed, I also have great confidence in the public prosecution that they'll bring those that should be held accountable for their actions. On the issue overall, that violence in the society in any form is unacceptable, and we do not accept that in any form.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, sexual assault services are not available across the province. Those that exist are under-resourced. Accompaniment in the justice and medical system is available only on an ad hoc basis in most areas. Mr. Speaker, today, Nova Scotians woke up to a horrifying story in the paper of a young girl who was the victim of a brutal attack. But let's face it, Mr. Speaker, we have woken up to story after story after story after story after story after story of sexual assault in this province, and I'll table those stories, Mr. Speaker. This morning's story shows the ineffectiveness of this government's anti-bullying initiative and its timid response to combating sexual assault. My question, will the Minister of Justice take a stand and commit today to implementing a province-wide strategy to address sexualized violence?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to come up and answer this question. We are a government that has been committed to dealing with issues such as domestic violence, the mental health and addiction strategy, poverty, housing, crime prevention framework, the alcohol strategy, the action plans on bullying and cyberbullying. The difference between us as a government and the opposition is that they don't have confidence in our police, that they don't have confidence in our public prosecution, they don't have confidence in our court. We have confidence, we believe in those processes, and that they do their jobs.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the NDP government has still failed to live up to their responsibilities to cover the outstanding creditors of SWASDA. The NDP has had no trouble handing over hundreds of millions of dollars to large corporations who in many cases turned around and laid Nova Scotians off and ordered them on using heavy-handed tactics to ensure that RBC, a SWASDA creditor, was paid their due. But, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the small businesses that are creditors for that organization, this government has done nothing. So my question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development is, will he take the necessary measures to ensure that the small businesses and their employees receive the money they are owed from SWASDA, an organization that he killed?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, I can stand here in my place and say that I am proud of the action that this government took with respect to SWASDA. Mr. Speaker, if governments in the past had looked at what was going on in SWASDA in a more conscientious effort, we wouldn't be in this situation today, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the situation is we have a lot of businesses that are left with outstanding monies owed to them because of this government's actions. We're just wondering when they're going to be paid.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If it hadn't have been for this government's actions, hundreds of thousands of dollars would have been just dropped into a deep hole. Mr. Speaker, it was this government that put a stop to the wasteful spending when it came to SWASDA, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, SWASDA's gone right now, but we are left with a lot of small businesses that are creditors of that defunct organization that require reimbursement for the services rendered. In the case of Garion Construction alone, they're owed over $367,000 on construction work. Why won't this minister help those small businesses when he came to the plate and ensured that RBC, the largest creditor, was paid their money?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the record will show that the taxpayers of Nova Scotia paid for those initiatives once. And what the member opposite is asking is if the taxpayers of Nova Scotia will not only pay a second time, but also for every other little small business in the province of Nova Scotia that the taxpayers should be on the hook for.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when the Minister of Community Services was responsible for childcare, she was all over the map. After a friendly press conference with CUPE, she said they will be adopting a liberal PEI model, which phases out private childcare facilities. And then, on the other hand, she'd say they had no plans to change the funding at all. She went back and forth 7 times, Mr. Speaker. It was enough to make you dizzy. So my question will be for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. Will the new minister responsible for childcare clear up the confusion caused by your predecessor and explain what it will be?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say that this is integration of services over at the Department of Education, and we're in transition at this time. And I'm very proud of the work that the department has been doing, and all departments, to make sure that our youngest citizens of the province of Nova Scotia are going to be viewed in a holistic manner from birth straight through their whole life. That we are looking forward to this integrated service that we are now providing at Education and Early Childhood Development Office. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria Lakes on his first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, last spring I asked the Minister of Community Services this same question. At that time, I pointed out on seven different occasions within 4 months where she flip-flopped on the government's position on this issue. Today, we still don't have any answers. But, Mr. Speaker, on February 5th, 2013, the Standing Committee on Community Services hosted the Department of Community Services to discuss the funding model for private and non-profit daycare centres. At that meeting, the Deputy Minister of Community Services said, and I quote, "There is no planning around actually moving away from our existing model." And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. So my question through you to the Minister is, can the Minister guarantee that the statement made 2 months ago by the Deputy Minister of Community Services is still true today?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Who was your question to? Okay. Oh, sorry, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. We're making a very strong commitment to our children in this province to make sure that we are having a plan put in place that is including all of our stakeholders, our parents and our families. We have a plan that we are moving forward with in this transitional time as we're integrating services over at the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Victoria Lakes on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, given the fact that childcare has been shifted to a new department, you have to wonder if the government is going forward with the Liberal PEI model they suggested last year. Nova Scotian families and small business owners have been confused and in the dark because of this government. They've been fed contradicting stories by the minister who once had childcare in her portfolio. Mr. Speaker, parents reserve and deserve the right to choose which childcare facility they send their children to. And the childcare program operators deserve to know what plans this government has. So my question through you to the minister is, will the minister assure parents that they will continue to have a choice about the kind of childcare they want for their children?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our children deserve the very best possible start in life, and this government is going to make sure that we are going to ensure that every child has that best start and the services that families need as they're raising their children. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, when the NDP made their reckless decision to cut the Yarmouth Ferry with no plan to reinstate the service, they did damage to the economy of the province far beyond what I'm sure they expected. Today, towns and communities are still struggling with that NDP cut. The town of Yarmouth has sent a letter to the Premier indicating that the situation has reached a critical point in Yarmouth, and we are at risk of losing more of our tourism infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. We have already lost half of our rooms in Yarmouth since this government's decision to cut the ferry, and we risk losing even more. My question to the Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism is, what will he do to ensure that there is a tourism sector in place in Yarmouth and Southwest Nova Scotia when a ferry comes back?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government is well aware of the tourism industry, not only in Southwest Nova Scotia, but right across this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has made significant investments to assist tourism in the Southwest region, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I look at, I read a resolution today, Mr. Speaker, about the hockey challenge, Mr. Speaker. You know, those are two significant investments that we made in the Southwest region to bring people in. Mr. Speaker, when I think about the Rod Hotel in Southwest Nova Scotia, another investment that we made in the area of tourism in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, when I hear the member talk about investments and certainly in a ferry, Mr. Speaker, we love nothing more than see a strong, viable ferry operation in Southwest Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we did appreciate the money that was given to the Junior A Challenge and the Rod Grand Hotel. The reason why that money was given to the Grand Hotel was because our last hotel, that one, was going to close without that money covering their losses. They lost money because the ferry was gone. We are having other tourism operations that are on the brink of closure. We have lost over 400 rooms since that NDP cut the ferry service. We have a tourism sector on the brink of collapse, and we need this government to step up to the plate and support it so that when a ferry comes back, we have rooms for people to stay here. Plain and simple, that's it. We met, ask the owners of Pictou Lodge how much the ferry meant to them. They lost 700 rooms annually because of this government's decision. Ask the operators in Badek, who lost 20 to 30% of their business, what the ferry meant to them. Ask the operators in Shelburne, who have lost 50% of their business. Ask White Point, who lost 50% of their American room bookings, what that ferry meant to them.
Order,
when is this
order,
minister?
Please. Order. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to introduce this afternoon in the West Gallery. I want to introduce my nephew Ryan Parker, who's up behind me. Ryan is a student at Dalhousie University, studying commerce or business, and I'd ask him to stand in the House to give him a very warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader to call government business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that you now leave the chair and the House resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole House on Supply.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker.